Hello and welcome to our unscripted discussion. I'm Tonya Mork.
And I'm Juliette Reinders Folmer. And this is Comference online.
So today what we want to do is I kind of want to just set the scene for you all, and then we're going to get into our discussion here. Is Juliette and I are going to have an unscripted discussion about a topic that we both have a lot of experience in and two have been impacted by. And we're hoping that today our goal is that there will be awareness being raised.
Yeah, and the topic is no open source project is an island. And we presume nearly everyone here at Comference contributes in one way or another to open source. Do you all?
We hope that you do. And if you do, what we're going to start to unveil for you is that it's true. No open source project is an island, although as we're working in a project, we have a tendency to focus on our project. But did you know that your project is impacted by what's upstream and downstream from you, or even circular? So I think we need to first start with talking about and laying the groundwork of what that means.
Yeah, because upstream, downstream, I've seen people put big question marks next to those terms, like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? So when I say upstream, what are you thinking? What are you thinking?
For
You
me,
have an open source project. And it's a PHP project.
mm-hmm.
What's upstream for you?
Yeah, so upstream can be everything from, if you go all the way back to the language itself, to all the tools that you're using, including your CI, your linters, and everything else in your project. You may even have some dependencies that you pull in that actually end up in your code base of whatever you're shipping out the door. Those are all your upstream things.
But also let's not forget something like Apache or web servers, because PHP as a language is one thing, but it still needs to run on something.
That's right.
And that's open source again. And then when people open it in their browser, presuming it's a web project, again, the browser is also a dependency basically to display what you're trying to do.
That's right.
And that then means that the end user's computer again also becomes a dependency.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we think about that when we're working on the front end sides of things and what we're serving up, right? So if you think about what's all in your dependency tool chain, all the way up and down, you've also got documentation as well in there. What tools are you using for that? So we start to see that though we have a project, it's made up of a lot of different tools from the browser through the server, all the way up and down.
Yeah. And if we then talk about downstream are basically, say you have dependencies on project, but there's other projects which depend on you. Say if you have a framework and your framework is being used by other projects, then you are their dependency and they are downstream from you.
That's right. That's right. So,
and end users might be downstream as well.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So the things that you do in your project impact them, right? So if you think about that, upstream, everything that happens in that impacts if you're downstream, so all the things that are upstream from yours are going to impact your project, and you impact whatever is downstream from you. Right. So understanding that, it's very, very important to understand that you're not isolated in an island. There's a lot of things upstream and downstream for users who get impacted at the final of what gets served out to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever you make a deprecation or you make a breaking change, downstream will be affected by it. But
right.
If upstream from you makes a breaking change or deprecates something, then your project will be affected.
That's right. But also think about it from this. What if you have a pain point in your project and it gets solved upstream from you? You've benefited from that now. Woo! Right? So same thing for you. What if you fix something or release a feature that, oh my goodness, can affect downstream, right? They gain all those benefits. So if we think about that, in your project, whatever your project's at, in that entire network, upstream, downstream, you can gain benefits and impacts depending upon what happens. And same thing from yours downstream.
Absolutely, absolutely. This the impact you can make is huge, no matter where you contribute. At the same time, I think it's one of those rare talents, but also an extremely valuable talent to develop. To when there is a problem, to be able to exactly pinpoint where it's coming from. Is this coming from upstream? Is this coming from downstream? Or is this a problem isolated to my own project?
That's absolutely right. A lot of times we'll see a problem that's in our project, understanding the source, the root cause of where that's at, and then fixing it where it exists, right, can have an impact not only for you, but can have an impact for everybody else who's also affected by wherever that point is. If we can start to think about this as a network, wherever that point is along in that network.
Yeah. Yeah, too often I see people just fix something in their own project without realizing that the underlying issue is actually bigger and it should be solved at the source,
Right.
And not at the point of where an error is thrown or a warning is thrown, but it should be solved at the underlying reason which causes that warning to be thrown. And that reason might be downstream, actually.
Might be.
Sometimes if there is an add-on to your project, or they may be doing something wrong.
That's right.
And your project will be throwing the warning or the error, but the actual cause is because the code in your project wasn't called in the correct way.
That's right. Right. We can go, that's like a rabbit hole we can really go down. That might be outside the scope of this talk. we deal with this a lot, but she's absolutely right. When you think about it, identify the root cause of something makes sense in an engineering concept or an engineering principle anyway, right? We want to find where the root cause is and fix it there. By doing that, we're getting to where that source is, but we can also start to think about impact. And I think that was something else that you wanted to talk about, Juliette, is understanding impact.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you just and only contribute to your own project and to your own code, you will impact your users. And that impact can be huge. It can be life-changing for people depending on what you're doing. At the same time, if, for instance, you find a bug and the bug comes from upstream will be used by more projects than just your project. It might be used by, 50,000 other projects. So if you fix it upstream, the impact of that fix will not just be beneficial to your project, but also to the other 50,000 users of that project.
That's exactly right. So this concept of understanding upstream, downstream, and how it impacts not only our projects, whatever project that you are investing a huge amount of time in, and a lot of us have that. We have this thing that we work on a lot. We give a lot of time to it. And then we have others that we contribute to. But in that thing that you're working on, you think about your impact and where you want to invest that impact. If it's upstream or downstream, mostly if it's way upstream, lots and lots of others, projects, and people are going to be impacted by that, including you.
At the same time, there's also say you have 50,000 projects which are dependent on you. And those 50,000 are all your users, but then they have their users. So there may be 49,999 projects which each have, and I'm just mentioning wild numbers, 1,000 users. And then one project out of those 50,000 which suddenly has 5 million.
Yep.
And that if that one project then complains about something, is it wrong to take that more seriously or to give that higher priority, or is that maybe the right thing to do? Because yes, the impact of all those other projects together is still less or equal to the impact which something that one project has a problem with yields.
Yeah, I guess that depends upon what you value in your project too. But if we're talking about from a global open source community, global, right, includes all of them.
Yeah.
Looking at what we prioritize and how we're working does matter if we want to be a good participant out there in the open source world, and understanding how all of these things are ripple effects. We're all connected, as we just laid out, upstream, downstream. And what happens and what we prioritize impacts not only our project, but anyone who is affected by that project, including users. So looking at the greater number, how many people are impacted by this, to me, that's a good metric. One of the metrics that we can use as well.
Yeah. And it's not just limited to the dependencies we actually know about. There's also all those things we're not even aware of. I mean, do you remember LeftPath? LeftPath was some really small 10-line JavaScript library or something.
Yep.
And someone took that offline, and suddenly the what was it, 50,000, 80,000 projects which depended on it all started breaking because they were missing LeftPath. And they didn't even realize they used it because it was dependency of dependency of dependency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this block of in a pyramid where there's so much underneath. And if you take out that crucial Jenga block at the bottom, everything comes tumbling down.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing how big the impact of some of the code we write can be, and how big the impact of us being other projects depending on our project can be an extremely humbling experience.
It definitely can. Now, we don't mean to bring this up to lock you up to feel overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, every line of code I write is going to have that much of a ripple effect. That's not the awareness that we're trying to raise here. Just so that you know.
If you work mostly on proprietary code, which goes directly to your end user, the company you work for, mm-hmm. It'll be a completely different playing field. You downstream, you have your end users, right. And upstream, you have all your dependencies. Mm-hmm. But if you work in open source, that isn't as clear cut, and there might even be circular dependencies where you are a dependency for them, but they are also a dependency for you.
I think that concept might make people stop for a minute and go, wait, what? That can happen? I think you've got a good example of that, don't you, Julia?
Well, I mean, the most simplistic example you can give is a testing framework. A testing framework may have dependencies on underlying parsers to parse certain parts of the code to make sure the testing works properly. Mm-hmm. But those parsers might again need a testing framework to test their code. Right. So they may depend on each other.
Yeah. See that circular? And it does happen. So that's why she was actually dealing with one of those recently in a domino effect of going down the rabbit hole, that it was like, ooh, that's a perfect example to bring out. And what I want to tell you is we have some real world examples of things that, as we're talking today, that it doesn't just sound hypothetical or theoretical, that we actually have some examples of some of the work that Juliette has uncovered and has been struggling with actually along the way, that can help to not provide a framework for you, but we want to also say that this doesn't just affect the PHP world or the HTML world or the CSS world. It's independent of a language.
I mean, it doesn't matter whether you program in Java or the ASP or
doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. It's the principle of what we're saying here applies everywhere. I mean, the fact that most of our examples will probably come from the PHP world is because that's where we are, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't apply anywhere else. This is the same everywhere.
That's exactly right. And some of these examples too are not necessarily just in the PHP language, right? So though myself, I work downstream at the point where I'm consuming these PHP languages and the tools and so on, way upstream, that may be in C. That may be even further on down the road is going to be in something completely different. So again, the language here is not the limiting factor.
No, but well, it can be limiting in where you can contribute,
It
at
can
least
be.
in code, but at the same time, that shouldn't limit you to contribute full stop.
It should
I
not.
mean, I think last week, Friday, was a perfect example. We went down the rabbit hole of a bug to do with Windows and recursive file directories, etc., etc. And we realized this was actually a pretty typical gotcha when you use a particular PHP function in a loop. And it's not necessarily something which needs to be fixed in PHP, but it is something to make more people aware of. So at the end of the session, once we'd fixed the immediate problem we were looking at, we also created a PR to update the documentation in the manual of PHP. Mm-hmm. Documentation is often just as important as code.
You think about it, if you're a programmer, a developer, an engineer who's working in software, if that documentation is one, not there or incorrect, how much time that's going to consume from you to be able to do the work you do. Documentation is critically important in the work, not only for those who are implementing things, but all the way up and downstream, can be for users as well, right? So a contribution into documentation is just as impactful.
And not just that. I mean, I'm old school. I've been basically in open source since the late 90s, and at that time open source was still small, and the guiding principle in most open source projects or in the whole open source world at the time really was very much, if you use something, you give back. And quite often, I mean, I was only starting as a developer. I barely knew what the hell I was doing. So quite often I came with a question, which I didn't know the answer to. So I'd open an issue, I'd write up my problem, I'd make sure I'd done my searches and due diligence to make sure that I really didn't know the answer and couldn't find it myself. But then if I'm asking something, if I'm asking the time of one of the maintainers of this project to help me, then let me give something back. What I couldn't give back in code at the time, I didn't have the skills at the time, but what I could do was maybe triage some issues. Mm-hmm. I could go through their issue list and just look at a number of them and see if I could answer them. There's always something you can answer. Absolutely. I mean, it might be a simple question about how to change something, which was simple to me at the time, but it wasn't simple for the person asking that question. Mm-hmm. So when you ask something, give something back. That was the principle. Mm-hmm. And for me, I still often apply that. And triaging issues is so important. If, as a maintainer, you've had a bug report and you haven't been able to reproduce, and you get someone else who comes in and says, I've actually been able to reproduce this. I have this issue as well. And these are the steps I took to reproduce it. Triaging like that will really help to prioritize issues correctly.
Yes.
And even just validating that something actually is an issue or, not user error. Mm-hmm. It saves so much time if you have people contributing that way. And it may seem something, busy work, but it still needs to get done. And we still need people to do it.
Yeah, and even tagging, going in and tagging or asking. There's not enough information about the steps to reproduce something. Just going and asking for that information moves those issues one step closer to resolution. That's contributing. So though you may be working in one project, by going and you've got something and you're asking a question but just doing what she just said is another way of having impact that can help upstream or downstream. That may just be something that you're curious that you're going to use in your particular project. So that is a good point.
I still often do it now. If I open an issue, I often just look at a few of the other issues to see if there's, some easy pickings I can give back. And quite often half of the issues, I can leave a comment saying like, hang on, wasn't this fixed in that and that PR? Can this issue be closed?
Mm-hmm.
Even just curating the issue list and making it shorter by not having the noise of things which are no longer relevant can help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd like to bring up something that that I brought up with the company that's sponsoring me as we start to think about this concept of where you are contributing to a project. You might be one node in this network, but when you start to think about that you're impacted upstream and what you do impacts downstream, then you start to realize that, wait a minute, a contribution to your project could also be defined and broadened to not just be your project, but you can start to think about, if I have interest in my project, I could go upstream and either sponsor some contributors or contribute myself or help to nurture and grow that community as well, because it can help me down here in my project that I care and nurture so lovingly for. So in that type of you give all your time, you're going to love it, right? So in that type of concept, if you are broadening your mind to think about, of course, you're going to invest a lot of your time in a particular area. But if you start to broaden it to think, what can I do? Maybe I have a company or companies that are sponsoring folks. You can also say, okay, how can I then get them to go upstream so they can help me down here in my project?
Yeah, and I mean the project through which we know both through which we met each other, through which we know each other is WordPress, and they have an initiative called Five for the Future, where they basically ask, if you're a company, if you make money off this open source project which we put out for free here, try and give 5% of your time back to this project to make it sustainable. Mm-hmm. And what always strikes me as odd is that that's where it ends. And instead of saying, okay, but that 5% should not just go to WordPress, it should also go to PHP or to PHP unit or to requests or to PHP mailer and all the dependencies of WordPress. Because on the one hand, there's a lot more projects still depending on those as well. And on the other hand, those projects need sustainability just as much as WordPress do.
Yeah, that project, for those who don't know that particular initiative, is companies that are downstream of WordPress coming back to contribute time to something that impacts them, which is upstream of them, which is WordPress. And that in itself, we start to think about, is broadening their circle. They're not just contributing to just their part. They're looking at, wait, what impacts me? And that's upstream. What she's saying is we can even go wider to say, what if you're a hosting company and you have folks who know how to write C, C++, Go, all these other languages, or folks who can do more documentation, that then they can start to look even further upstream and start to also contribute there, or even downstream.
And it doesn't end there. I mean, we mentioned various forms of contributing. Contributions can also take the form of translations, and whether it's translating a manual, like the PHP manual. I know the French translations are looking for contributors at this moment, but it can also be translation of user interface language. And making something more accessible to a wider group of users is also a form of contributing, even if you don't have any technical knowledge. If you are an international company, you will have people who speak different languages.
That's right. That's right. One thing I do want to stop and recognize is that if you're in a particular project, you want to grow and nurture your contributors, right? Because it's hard to get contributors that will stay and will provide valuable contributions that move your project forward into your roadmap and to your vision. So, of course, where everyone is competing for folks to come and contribute. So, of course, you're going to have initiatives that want to grow and nurture folks to focus on the thing. I keep saying that. The thing that you're giving all your time and love to, that thing that you're nurturing. And that makes sense, of course. But in that scope, you may also find, I'm just going to raise this, you may also find that if you were to think more broadly, you could start to see that your interests, that project you have, could also be benefited from doing something upstream that may be causing you pain points, or some initiatives that could help you for the future, set you up, those stepping stones, so you don't have to work around them or be impacted by when a change happens here and it causes a whole bunch of work that you go, and then, but you weren't contributing upstream to that.
Yeah, or as a project, you could say, hey, but I want everything in my own sphere of control, like Facebook, which went down the other week,
Mm-hmm.
which had pulled everything into their own control and suddenly locked themselves out. That is, we don't want dependencies, so we do everything ourselves. And now suddenly, if one thing breaks, you only got yourself to blame. But there's literally no fallback then.
Mm-mm.
And the fact that we're part of this landscape of open source projects, which all depend on each other, yes, it creates a dependency, but it also creates a community. And
That's right.
and to me, it's always strange that there's talk of PHP community, Symfony community, Laminas community, Magento community, WordPress community, Joomla community. We're all one community.
Mm-hmm.
We in the end, we all use the same base tools. We all use the same language.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we all talking with each other?
Why aren't we? No, seriously, we're asking. Why
Yeah.
aren't we? We should be. We're not islands.
Yeah.
I work a lot I come from a robotics background, but then moved into the open source sphere and work now in WordPress because it powers so much of the web. But why aren't we talking outside? And that's kind of the point of this, is as we're looking at this from a bigger perspective of, yeah, we should be. We're all one big open source community that could be helping one another even more.
Yeah. And I've been trying to build those bridges for
You have
years
been.
now. I have spoken at Drupal, Joomla, Magento conferences, to name a few, and PHP conference and WordPress conferences. But it's hard. It's the one person. I can't sway the balance of things. I can try to open people's minds a little, and that's what we're trying to do also today.
Mm-hmm.
But it's up to you, the listener, to make the actual difference. But anything you do generally will impact more projects. I mean, I can give you an example of something I worked on this weekend. I went down yet another rabbit hole of dominoes related with PHP 8.1. A far file of one of the CI tools wasn't working correctly on PHP 8.1. It was throwing deprecations while I knew I'd fixed those deprecations a while back. So I went looking into how is this far being generated and what's going on there. And then I ended up at the far generation tool, because they were using another open source project for that. And I found that there's certain syntax of PHP 8, not even 8.1, 8 not being accounted for. But if you then realize that that particular tool which generates the var is not just used by the one project I was looking into which had the problem, but it's used by about 50% of all CI tools in the PHP sphere.
Did you hear that? Think about that magnitude. 50% of all CI tools.
Yeah. And all of those will generally, in one way or another, run into the problem I identified.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I pulled a fix, but it's not it's a fix for the immediate problem, but there are more problems still there. Mm-hmm. And I can't solve everything, mm-hmm. But if everyone would discover something, would take the effort to report it and report it correct in a good way that it's reproducible and actionable upstream. If people if they have the chance and the skill set, take the time to actually fix what they can. And then for maintainers, instead of having to do all that maintaining work themselves, their burden gets slightly less, but they do still have a burden because they do still have to review and they do still have to merge and release it. Because even when things are fixed, if they're only fixed in master or in develop, and it hasn't been tagged in a release, your users are still not going to find that fix, and they're still not going to benefit from it.
That's right. That's right. So I think we're kind of starting to touch upon the next part of what we wanted to make sure that we talked to you about today and discussed. We talked about contributing in all the many forms, right? We talked about upstream, downstream, circular, so that you can understand that. We talked about how you can have impact all the way up and down. And hopefully that was clear. And if not, ask us a bunch of questions. But then how can we all work together, right? So if we're one big community, and no matter where you're at on that network, whatever your node happens to be, you have impact there. And you can also contribute upstream and downstream. Maybe we just need to start to talk about a little bit more. Okay, what can you do, and how can we all work together?
Well, I think the first thing we should all realize is we're all human beings. Even though we may never meet, even though we are just avatars and nicknames on a screen, there is a human behind the other end of that screen. So first of all, always be kind to each other. Second of all, if you're using open source and you're not paying for it, and generally speaking that is the case, maintainers don't owe you anything. So be polite. You can't go around demanding things. Asking is one thing. Reporting, trying to help out, sending in fixes, that's another thing. But demanding, sending people death threats, I mean, be kind, be polite, and realize your position. Mm-hmm. You are the beneficiary of this huge gift of open source. Mm-hmm. So behave like that. Mm-hmm. With acknowledgement of that.
And all of us can help nurture that too. When we see it and we're not being kind, or someone's not being kind, we can call that out and help in that regard. The quickest way to get ignored by a maintainer is to not do your due diligence. Don't set up things to report things in a way that they can actually act upon it. Act snotty or unkind. That's another quick way. Come in and start demanding. That's another quick way.
But that can actually have a much larger impact. That can be really off-putting for a maintainer, and it can throw someone off their stride in such a way that their productivity for the rest of the day has been demolished.
That's right.
Because of what it's does to them emotionally when they receive those kind of comments.
That's right. Remember, it's open source for them too, and they're human too. So for the stuff to get fixed and actually get merged and tagged, we need to keep our maintainers healthy and sustainable and happy.
And don't make presumptions. I mean, the amount of times, and I'm not too sensitive about it, but it's still wrong. The amount of times I've been misgendered on GitHub. Dear sir. I mean, I'm not making a secret of the fact that I'm a woman. It actually says Juliette on my profile. I'm also not making it extremely obvious. I don't have a photo of me there. But either don't gender someone or use the right gender. Mm-hmm. And something like that, for me, it might not really be an issue, though I will call you out on it. For someone else, it may really be something which touches on something they are struggling with. So be careful, be considerate of the fact that you do not know who's on the other end of the screen, and therefore treat them with respect.
In fact, we're all humans. How about if we all just treat each other with respect? Be kind.
Yeah.
Right? And help one another. Again, we're a community. And I think with that kind of hits on everything that we wanted to talk about today. And hopefully you have that, I really am not an island, even though I'm in my bubble and I focus right here in my project all day long. I'm impacted upstream and I'm impacting others. So how can we all work together? We, as in open source, how can we all collaborate to help one another, to be able to provide the value that we're trying to provide for all those who use the projects that we invest so heavily in?
Yeah. Well, and it all starts with awareness, an awareness of all the dominoes, and the fact that if you touch on one domino, you might impact upstream or downstream or both. And
That's right.
yeah, you are part of a much larger chain of projects.
You are. Hopefully we didn't just blow your mind there. We were like, oh my gosh.
I know. I think the people who come to conference, they are awesome. So most of them will have some awareness of this, and yeah, let's not
Yeah,
underestimate our listeners.
not trying to.
I know
Yeah,
you
so
know.
I know. So thanks so much for joining our talk. We hope that you stick around to have any questions that you may have or want to talk a bit more about this, whether that's here in conference or throughout open source. We look forward to contributing with you.
Yeah, we'll be around in Discord at various points throughout the rest of the day. So feel free to drop questions there if you have them. And yeah, I look forward to seeing the rest of the talks. And who knows, we might see you at game night tonight.
All
Yeah.
righty. Thanks for coming.
Bye bye.